Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. So we're thinking about the Sabbath, the Lord's Day, and we're trying to work out some practical issues about how best to make the most fruitful use of this time that the Lord has given us. We've been thinking about the priorities of rest so that we can worship and have fellowship with one another, and those works that we want to do being focused principally on works that are necessary and works of mercy, works of kindness and grace to other people. There are a bunch of other questions we need to think about in relation to work, particularly those who have jobs or vocations which call upon them on the Lord's Day on a regular basis. We will talk about that in a subsequent video, but for now I want to address another question, which is one that our Reformed forefathers in the faith touched upon. It's the question of what some of the Puritans called lawful recreation on the Sabbath. The Puritans were fond of using the term Sabbath to refer to the Lord's Day. And the question that they were addressing was the question of whether it's legitimate on Sunday to do the kinds of activities, games, sports and so on, that would be legitimate at other times, but that don't directly fall under these 5 headings: rest, worship, fellowship, works of necessity, works of mercy. Is it okay, for example, to go play football in the park, or cricket in the park, or baseball in the park, or basketball on your drive, or wherever you might play and whatever game you might play? Is it okay to watch TV? Is it okay to go and play, go for a walk, go and do anything else that you might do? Board games, all those kinds of things that you might normally do to relax on the Lord's Day. And there were a substantial number of Puritans, in fact, who said, no, it's not. They insisted, in fact, that we should abstain from even lawful recreations on the Lord's Day. And they insisted that Scripture taught this. In fact, this is found in the Westminster Standards. It's one of the small points at which, personally, I take a minor exception, along with most modern Reformed ministers, actually, to the teaching of the Westminster Standards. I don't think that Scripture forbids lawful recreation on the Lord's Day. But it's important just to think through this question, because the Puritans and their forebears and those who came after them were onto something. And there are some cautions that it's helpful for us to be aware of in this connection. Let me first just talk through the reasons why they thought that this was a problematic approach to the Lord's Day. They really stem around the interpretation of one text in the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 58. And if you read Isaiah 58:13, verse 13, the prophet says, in rebuking the people of Israel and calling them back to faithfulness, if you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight and the day of the Lord honourable, if you honour it, not going your own ways or seeking your own pleasure or talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. That's verse 13 and 14. In other words, what the prophet is saying to the people of Israel is, if you take the Sabbath as it's supposed to be, take delight in the Lord, take delight in the Sabbath, and turn away from doing, quote, your pleasure on my holy day, then you will experience the Lord's kindness and blessing and forgiveness and mercy once again. So you can see how this could easily be interpreted. Somebody might say, well, your pleasure refers to the things that you normally like doing. And the prophet here castigates the people of Israel for doing those normally lawful, pleasurable leisure activities on the Sabbath. They should abstain from sports and games and watching TV, not that they would have had them, obviously, but all those normal things which we do just to relax, we shouldn't do them. We should focus ourselves instead on other things. Now, it's important to understand why this is actually a misreading of the prophet. The term your pleasure in this context does not refer to those normally lawful and good leisure pursuits. The way you can tell that is because of the way the same term is used in verse 3. This is the text that the students at the Bible and Theology class and I looked at briefly. There's actually a chiastic parallel between verse 3 and verse 13 in this text. I'll leave you to dig out the chiasm if you want to spend a few minutes looking at this chapter. But where the same term, your pleasure, is used here, it is parallel with, you oppress all your workers. And the prophet continues, you fast only to quarrel and fight and hit with a wicked fist. In other words, your pleasure in this framework, within the context that the prophet is speaking of it, doesn't refer to fun games and normally fun things that you enjoy doing, leisure pursuits. It rather refers to the ungodliness of a wicked employer doing what is your pleasure and just oppressing your workers, or the ungodliness of men who fight and argue doing your pleasure when your pleasure is just to be argumentative. It's not that they're playing games on the Sabbath. It's that they're oppressing the poor and fighting with one another. That is the pleasure that the prophet castigates the people for indulging on the Sabbath. In other words, I don't think Isaiah 58 prohibits what our Reformed forefathers called lawful recreation. And therefore, in general, turning to our contemporary situation, thinking about the Lord's Day, I don't think there's anything wrong in principle with doing the kinds of things we were talking about, watching TV, playing games, playing sports, all those kinds of things. We don't need to live in the kind of world where the only things that we're allowed to do are strictly Christian things. This is often where this teaching has ended up, where the room has been filled with silence and people sitting on hard-backed chairs reading Christian books. Now, it's perfectly fine. Sit in silence, read a Christian book if you want to. Totally fine. But I don't think we can require that on the grounds of Scripture. But I hinted already that there are one or two cautions I'd want to urge us to observe, and actually, to their great credit, the students, again, at the Bible and Theology programme, drew out these very, very rapidly. They spotted there are some dangers here. While it's fine to go play in the park, watch TV, sports and so on, it's incredibly easy for those things to get in the way of the things that we ought to be doing. Resting from our work so that we can worship, fellowship with one another, works of mercy, works of necessity. And that means that, practically speaking, it's possible to give some fairly well-defined wisdom or advice about what's a bad idea. So you might say, playing baseball, great idea, go play baseball in the park, totally fine. But would you join a baseball club that always had its games all day Sunday afternoon? Because what that's going to do is going to put in place a structure which makes it impossible for you easily to respond to other legitimate calls on your time on the Lord's Day. And eventually, you're going to get to the point where, a year or two has gone by and the only thing you've done on the Lord's Day is you've not worked and you've worshipped, but you've never had any fellowship with believers. You've never gone and helped your grandparents to remove the fallen down tree from their front yard. You've never helped with the housework and other works of necessity that you might helpfully get involved with. In other words, if we schedule things like this too concretely, they will restrict our ability to use this day in the way that it's supposed to be used in the long term. So we ought to be careful then about those kind of regular commitments. Similarly, I think we'd want to be flexible, wouldn't we? We'd always want to be in a position where if the need arose, let's say to go visit somebody in hospital or to help somebody in some practical way, we're able generally to have that time on the Lord's Day free to serve in that way, at least most of the time. The other thing, of course, which is perfectly obvious, is that you never want to get into a situation where those commitments are pushing out worship on the Lord's Day. I remember seeing a viral video a number of years ago, which I think the authors intended to be amusing, and it kind of was until you realised what it was saying about our culture. The video was about a worship service in a Lutheran church, I think. The minister was fully robed, and the entire service lasted about 90 seconds. He went through it 50 times faster than normal in order to make this kind of big hilarious joke about, we all need to get home because it was, guess what? Yes, it was Super Bowl Sunday. So we have a 90-second service of worship done at triple quick speed so that we can all get home to what we're really interested in worshipping on this day. Now that, I don't need to tell you, I mean, it's kind of funny because it's not funny, and it's a fairly sad commentary on the seriousness or lack of seriousness with which many professing Christians treat the Lord's Day in the contemporary Western church, and that's the temptation that we face. We will always be in a position where there's something that calls upon that time, and it's holy time. We will be fruitful as disciples of Christ if we don't let anything draw us away from that time of worshipping the living God. And of course, as I said, that does raise questions about the value of those vocations that require us to be drawn away on a regular basis, and we will get to that. Those vocations are valuable, and there is a place for Christians to be involved in them, but that's not the same thing as Super Bowl Sunday detracting from worship. More to follow on all those subjects in the next day or two. For now, the Lord bless you, and I hope very much to see you soon. Bye for now.